and welcome to episode 35 of the Monday Night Review. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone who managed to listen to last week's episode on the Mary Celeste. The cold was fierce and it's much better this week. Though still present, not quite as bad. It was a bit of an effort to edit last week because the coughing and the sniffing was just appalling. So if you thought it was appalling to listen to, just imagine how I felt editing it. Now, today we're going back on the London Tube. We haven't been on the Tube for a while because I just couldn't find a story to float my boat for Angel, which is where we are. I couldn't find a story and I didn't want to... It was proving really difficult and I thought I should just learn to grow up and be one of those people that can skip stuff. I could skip Angel if I'm not finding anything, but I'm not one of those people. So anyway, I tracked down the case we're going to cover today and I write it and I then think, I'm going to look I'm reading this really great book about London murders, so I have a look in there. Dr. Crippen. One of the most famous London murderers of all time. How did I miss it? Anyway, we're not doing Crippen. You've probably heard about Crippen. I can do it separately. Angel, for those of you who don't know, it's weirdly... I don't think it's a very well-known part of London, but it is a very well-known part of London to Londoners. It's really lovely. It's a really nice area of London. And when I first moved to London, when I was in my late teens and I lived in really dodgy areas, I had a friend called Joe who was married to a Londoner at the time, and they had a grown-up married house just near Angel. So I used to go and hang out with her. And it was very nice to be able to go and stay somewhere a bit more swish than I was used to. But as with everywhere in London, there are dodgy bits too. So part of my problem with stuff when I'm looking for things for the London Tube is there's just quite a lot of recent stabbings. And although I really want to cover those stories, I also am aware that some are just too recent. And it feels a bit soon. So anyway, today we're going back to 1890, which I think we can all agree isn't too soon. And we're going to the lovely area of Canonbury, which is now it's a very swanky residential area around Angel. And we're going to talk about the murder of Frances Maria Wright. So Canonbury now is full of lovely houses and it's very much part of London, but in 1890 it was a leafy suburb. It was a place where professionals could live, that was close to the city, but it had fresh air and space. It's got these beautiful villas, terraces, cottage-style houses, and it's where 69-year-old bank clerk Charles Wright lived. And he was at 19 Canonbury Terrace in a 6-room villa with 2 kitchens, which he shared with his wife, Frances, who was 71 and she'd been suffering with bronchitis. And she's basically infirm. In the 1890s, 71 is pretty good going. She's not very well and she has just had bronchitis. So they get married in 1843 in Newington, and then they move to Southwark, where they have their daughter Frances, and then they move to Islington, and sadly soon after their move to Islington, Frances dies at the age of 17, leaving just the two of them in their house and a servant girl who they had to help. So recently they've been struggling with servants though, and they weren't keeping them for very long, and by the time we get to May 1888, they hadn't had a regular servant girl for 9 months, which all sounds very luxurious, but if you're in your 70s and you're ill and you're not used to doing certain things in your house, it probably is a pretty drastic thing. On the 16th of May, Charles Wright leaves his house just before 2 p.m, as was usual for him. I'm assuming he's going to work. And he leaves his wife at home and he's told her to put the chain across the door. She's been bothered by a man visiting the house, I think it was the day before, to ask about the water supply. And she'd felt that this was a ruse to check the house out or get an idea of who was in at what time. And so because she'd been worried about this, her husband said, put the chain across the door and just don't open it to anyone that you're not expecting. And he made sure that the door was properly closed before he left. When he returns home just after 5, he's greeted by a crowd of people outside his house, and he gets told that his wife's dead. So he's taken upstairs to identify the body of his wife, and he says it's her. She looks normal, except for a slight mark. Now, some stories say above, some stories say below. All stories agree it's her left eye. So she's got this mark, which I'm assuming is the beginning of a bruise. And he says that wasn't there this morning. So his initial thoughts are that she must have suffered a fall, but the crowd outside the house are talking about a burglary, and so Wright checks the house over and says that there's nothing missing, and there's no real sign of disruption as there would be if there had been a burglary. 5 years previously, whilst on holiday by the coast, they had been burgled, and most of their stuff, their valuables, had been taken then. And they hadn't bothered to kind of replace it. I think that one story says there's a load of silver plate that's stolen, and they just haven't bothered to replace it all. And so how does this crowd know about this woman's death? If your wife's fallen down the stairs, you don't necessarily have a crowd of people outside. So he has left the house just before 2. At 2:30 that afternoon, Wright's neighbour, Madame Bertha Prévotel, had been watching the street from an upstairs window, and she'd watched 2 men go up the steps to the Wright's house and knock on the door. One of the men, she said, was carrying a bag, and once the door was open, she watched themselves force themselves inside the house and then heard 2 or 3 screams. So Madame Prévotel, who I'm assuming is not very agile, not, maybe she's in a chair, she calls to her friend who she lives with, who's Madame Chef de Ville, who is the hero of this story for me anyway, to tell her that what she's seen, and she says that her friend's got to go over and see what's going on. So Madame Chef de Ville is not a scaredy woman. She goes over and she knocks on the door, and she can hear moving inside the house, but she doesn't get any response. So she knocks 3 more times and still gets no response, and she sees another neighbour, and she sends that neighbour to go and fetch a policeman. So while the neighbour's gone to fetch the policeman, the 2 men rush out of the house, and Madame Chef de Ville shouts, "Burglars!" and then gives chase. She hoiks up her skirts, I like to imagine, and off she goes. The men split up, and Chef de Ville follows the man carrying the bag, probably assuming that if there has been a burglary, he's carrying the stolen goods. And she pursues him for some time, shouting at passers-by in a mix of English and French. So lots of people didn't understand. Her English is not good. And obviously she's running. She is described as portly, and English is not her first language. So I'm assuming she's shouting quite a lot in French. But slowly people clock onto the fact, I mean, you've got a woman pointing and shouting at a man that's running away. So word gets out that, and she gets a sort of following. She has a small crowd, and they're all shouting "stop thief" and "burglar" and things. And so the man drops his bag between 2 furniture vans and accelerates off, basically. So they're able to find the bag, and Madame Chef de Ville is able to give a good description of the man that she's chasing. She says he's in his early 20s and dressed in a long overcoat and a round hat. Back at the Wright's home, the neighbour that went to find the policeman has returned with a policeman, and they've entered the house via the back kitchen, and they find Frances Wright slumped against the wall in the hallway at the foot of the stairs. She's in a half-sitting position with her arms outstretched, and she is dead, but she's still warm to the touch. So they think that she's died incredibly recently. And indeed, a post-mortem concludes that it's the stress of the robbery that caused her weak heart to give out from shock. She's got a very diseased heart, so that's what did it. And under her dress, which, I mean, some people say in her dress pocket, but one of the accounts I read says under her dress, which they seemingly searched at the scene, which I think is a little bit personal. The police inspector finds 2 pockets, and they're tied around her waist and sort of hidden in her skirt. And in one's £17, 10 shillings in gold, and in the other there's 12 shillings and some keys, and she's sort of pinned these, but they say concealed from view, so it's really hard to know how this is done. But basically she's got hidden pockets on her with her money in it. So whether she'd done this because she was concerned about the area, or the funny thing about this story is there's lots of conflicting things where people have said, why would they rob an impoverished house? I don't think you own a 6-bedroom villa that has 2 kitchens if you're that impoverished. I think there's probably not a lot to steal because they've been burgled and they hadn't replaced stuff, live within their means. So I don't know that it's very, also having £17 in 1890 on your person doesn't scream poverty to me. So as with everything, the press gets involved and it speculating about what happened. As with everything, the press gets involved and the Times speculate about what happened. Was it a run-of-the-mill burglary gone wrong with the accidental death of an elderly resident? And yeah, they refer to this poverty-stricken house. So a few days after the incident, an inquest's held, and the jury returns a verdict of willful murder by persons unknown. No surprises there. The 2 men need to be found, and detectives issue descriptions, no doubt given by the badass madames over the road. And the first man is described as being 5'6", dressed in black trousers, vest, and dark cutaway coat. The second was shorter at 5'1" and of military appearance, with a tweed trousers and a vest. And so we don't know which one Madame was chasing, but she's very able to go and see a lineup, which she does. They round up all of the known criminals in the area and work out who's got an alibi and who hasn't. And Madame Chef de Ville ends up seeing about 30 of them in a lineup, and she says that the man's not in the lineup, but she does manage to point out a man who has the same physique as him. So there's a small stocky man that she points out and says that's what he was built like, but this guy's not in the lineup. So there's not a lot that they can do. They've rounded up everyone they can think of. They've got no more leads. But then weirdly and luckily, a landlord of a local pub comes forward and he says that a few days before the murder, 3 men and a woman had been drinking in his pub, and he'd caught snatches of their conversation. And it seemed like they were planning something and they're up to no good. And one of the men was carrying a carpet bag, which sounded a lot like the one that had been found by the police. So again, it's all descriptions and vague snippets of conversation. And in this conversation, Spitalfields and Great Eastern had been mentioned. So they concentrated the search to the East End and Spitalfields and then expanded to Clerkenwell. So remember, they've also got the carpet bag that's been dumped by one of the men. And the fact that he has this bag in a time where man bags were not the thing suggests he was probably a skilled labourer or an engineer, and this was sort of his work bag, his bag for his tools. Lots of residents see this case as a prime example of the downside of living in leafy Canterbury. The police didn't bother to do their job properly. Women were being assaulted in broad daylight. No one was safe in their homes. Again, this is another thing that changes from description to description. They're living in this beautiful house. It is a suburb that is great for those who work in the city, which has a certain implication of a certain wage. But the police, whether the police aren't doing their job properly because it's a well-to-do area and therefore the crime rates are lower, I think is probably the case. But in some places you read it like it's this hinterland where anything can happen because the policing is so low and it's not very built up. So, on the 22nd of May, around 2,000 people gather to see Mrs. Wright's funeral cortege off on its long journey to Nunhead Cemetery, and it's even escorted by officers of the Metropolitan Police Force who walk on either side of the cortege to the boundary of their division, which is Islington Green. But after that, the case goes cold. Murder then, as sadly now, is not uncommon in the city, and the resources are just moved to other crimes. They've run out of leads. But a breakthrough comes out of the blue in August of 1888 when Sergeant Michael Walsh is doing his beat around Old Street, which is just up the road from Angel. And he's approached by a woman who says she's just been assaulted. Now, it's 19-year-old Phoebe Field, and she gets taken to the police station and she explains that her partner has beaten her, believing that she was seeing another man. And this man is called Henry Glennie. And when asked who Henry Glennie is, she says, oh, he did the Canterbury murder. So Sergeant Walsh thinks, right, I've got to keep questioning her. So he asks how she knows Glennie's the murderer. So she says she's met Glennie a few weeks earlier at a friend's house in King's Cross. He'd just returned to London and he was starving, and they hit it off and they went home together. They went back to her house and he promised to look after her, and he requested that she go and live with him in his room off the Caledonian Road, and she agrees. And the next day her partner Alfred Edwards, who's a diamond fitter by trade, finds out, and he goes around and confronts them, and they have a big hoo-ha in the street. And the conversation apparently went, I'm not going to have her going with men who are stealing and burgling and breaking into houses, Edwards says. I've not got her for that at all, Glennie replied. You meet me tonight and I'll have it out with you. I might as well be killed for 6 or 7 as for 1. So Field said a few nights later that Glennie was talking in his sleep and he seemed really upset and he was muttering about murder. And she asks him the next day what that was about, and he confesses to the Canterbury murder and tells her the name of his accomplices. He says that it's Long Bob and Eldest Parsons. Now, the thing that I always find really confusing through this is he names these 2 accomplices, and they are part of the story, but from the Madame Chef de Ville, we know that only 2 men were in the house. He says, so Glennie says that an ex-servant's given him information about the house, though what the information is, I don't know, as most of the valuables have been stolen before, but whether it's the lady of the house often carries a fair sum of cash on her, or whether they keep cash in the house, even though he's a bank clerk, so that seems unlikely. Anyway, the men had apparently knocked on the door and said they were there to inspect the gas fittings and then barged their way in. He had said to Frances Wright to keep quiet and he wouldn't hurt her. But she'd screamed and he'd hit her on the side of the head and she'd fallen down. So Long Bob then started searching her pockets, but it became apparent that she was dead, and he said that he wasn't searching a dead woman, and they run off. So Glennie warns Field that if she tells anyone that she will be killed. But a few days later, Field leaves Glennie to go back to Edwards. And so this is where we are. So Field's not considered a reliable witness, and her confession story changes from telling to telling. But at least they have a suspect to check out, and Henry Glennie fitted the bill well. She'd told the police that he'd asked her to pawn a long black coat, which was similar in description to the one that Madame Chef de Ville said the man was wearing when she was chasing him. And the police managed to track it down in the pawn shop. So there's obviously truths in her story. So until February 1888, Glennie was working making coal for gas stoves at the Eagle Range Company, and not only did he use a bag for his tools, but the carpet bag found by the police was identified by two of his ex-colleagues as his, and the police track Glennie down, but they don't arrest him immediately. They watch him to see what he gets up to and to see if he will lead them to his accomplices. They think that eldest Parsons refers to Charles Parsons, who is already known to them. He's been tried for a robbery of a watch in March that year, and some stories have it that he was sentenced to 5 years, and some stories have it that he actually was acquitted. Obviously, if he's sentenced to 5 years, that would rule him out from being able to be part of this robbery in May. So Glennie's eventually arrested on the night of the 19th of September, and he's taken to Upper Street Police Station. He says that on the day of the murder, he was at his sister's confectionery shop in Neasden, and he spent the night there. So when he's shown the bag, he examines it and his face grows really pale. He looks really scared, and he says it is his, but he had sold it to a man at the Star and Garter pub on the Caledonian Road a week after he left his job at the Eagle Range Company, which would make sense. And if you're in the pub and you don't have any money and you want to buy another round, selling stuff that you have exactly something you would do, especially if you've left that job and you have no need for that, for the tools or whatever it is anymore. I also think it's quite clever thinking, because they show him the bag and ask if it's his, and I mean, I guess he wouldn't know why they had it unless he knew that he'd left it at the scene. It's all very confusing, but anyway, I think it's quite a good lie if it is a lie. So the police charge him with murder, and they set about finding other witnesses. So they've got Phoebe Field. And a couple of days later, 4 days later, when Mary Dominy, who's sometimes known as Polly, is arrested and she's brought into Upper Street Police Station. It doesn't say what she's arrested for, but I'm assuming it is sex work. She's a 21-year-old char lady, and she'd worked at the Wright's house up until about 6 weeks before the murder, when she'd left to look after her baby. And though initially she refused to speak, she admitted to knowing Glennie, and she suspected him of his involvement in the crime. She'd spoken to him about it and seen it in the paper, and he admitted to her that it was him and the murder had been a mistake. And he apparently said, "Did you see the French lady chasing me in the illustrations in the picture?" And she had said yes. So again, quite a definite link to the case. But she swore blind that she hadn't told them what was in the house or suggested it to them, and said that perhaps another ex-servant called Amy was responsible for this. So the police have now got two witnesses. They've got the bag, they've got the trench coat, and they've got the witnesses who saw him leaving the house, and an admission that he'd been told about the Wright's house from someone who worked there, and that's enough to go to trial. He couldn't deny knowing about the Wright's house because he has had conversations with people about it. So the trial begins on the 29th of October 1888, and Wright, the two Madames, members of the chasing crowd, the doctor, the investigating officers, and Glennie's colleagues at the Eagle Range Company are all called to the witness stand. There's a cabbie called John Jones who had joined the crowd in pursuit of the attacker. And he identified Glennie from a lineup of 17 men, as did housewife Johanna Rowe. However, Glennie's savvy barrister, Austin Metcalf, was really ready to savage Field and Dominy, accusing Dominy of having a history of stealing, shoplifting, and sex work, and saying that she had illegitimate children with a man who was locked up in prison for highway robbery. And although she denied this, she did admit that she was receiving a guinea a week from the police to tide her over during the trial. And Field, it turned out, was also being paid, and she was living with a sergeant because she was scared of her life. And this was frowned upon, both that she was living with a sergeant and they were both being paid. But the sergeant who was paying them from his own pocket believed that it was worth the money to keep them safe and to keep them happy so that they would go to trial. It was also really played up that Field's story had changed. Long Bob had become Long Jack, and he had become, in the story, the one who hit Frances Wright, not Glennie. She was forced to admit sex work, and that, of course, makes her less human to everyone. And Metcalf also in questions Inspector Glass, implying that he's tried to force a confession out of Glennie, which Glass vehemently denies. But again, if you're trying to get a jury over on your side, then it doesn't look great. So the real ace in the hand for the defence was that Glennie's sister, Marianne Swallow, confirmed his alibi, saying that he'd arrived in Neasden to stay with her on the 15th and not left the house at all the following day, which was the 16th, which was the day of the murder. And this is confirmed by a dressmaker who'd come to the house on the 16th and seen Glennie there. Glennie's brother-in-law also said that the black trench coat was his and he'd given it to Glennie in June. This, coupled with the loose women witnesses, meant that after just 5 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. The case was over and faded away. Charles Wright married Jane Collett in December of 1888, so not even a year after his wife died. He was 69 and Jane was 42, and they lived at her boarding house in Highbury, which is just up the road from Angel, until he died, which was 2 years later, and he left an estate valued at £125, which I should have worked out what that was, but it's not shabby. Glennie gets married in 1890, and in the 1901 consensus, it lists him as a hot water boiler fitter, and it's believed that he's the same Glennie that dies in Hammersmith in 1930 at the age of 67. Bizarrely, in 1890, a burglar, Frederick Bedford, confesses to the murder of Frances Wright, but he is a well-known liar, so it's never taken any further, it's never looked into, and the murder of Frances Wright remains unsolved to this day. I think probably Glennie had something to do with it. I think her heart gave out. I think either he bumped her on the head and her heart gave out, or just it was going to happen anyway. Not that that's an excuse. You shouldn't go and rob people's houses. But yes, that's the story of the murder of Frances Wright. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's a bit of a quickie, but we're back on the tube. As always, thank you so much to everyone who has signed up for Patreon, who has bought me a coffee, and who emails in and sends me suggestions or leaves a review. It makes a huge difference. And also, if you tell your friends or anyone you think might be interested in the podcast, that would be amazing. You can find us on Instagram at The Monday Night Review. You can find us on Facebook at The Monday Night Review. You can send us an email, which is themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. Remember that review is spelled REVUE, And until next time, be kind, stay safe, always check the back seat before you drive.